The wind howled through the trees, rattling the bare branches like dry bones. The night was colder than any before, the kind that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. Snow piled high against the fence, the driveway buried under a thick, white blanket. Inside the small cabin, a fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows against the wooden walls. James had lived alone in these mountains for years. He was used to the solitude, the quiet nights with only the wind and the distant calls of wildlife to keep him company. But tonight, something felt different. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest, a weight pressing against his ribs like a warning. Then he heard it, a faint sound, muffled by the wind, a scraping, a shuffling, something moving just beyond the porch. James frowned, setting down his coffee. He pulled his coat tighter around him and moved toward the front door. As he reached for the handle, another sound cut through the storm, a low, desperate whinny. His breath hitched. A horse. Out here in this cold. James yanked the door open and the freezing air slapped him in the face. Snowflakes swirled in the porch light, the wind carrying them like tiny shards of glass. And then, standing there in the dim glow, was a Mustang. The wild horse stood trembling, his thick coat dusted with ice. His mane was tangled with frost, his breath coming out in heavy, ragged puffs. But it wasn't just the cold that made James's stomach tighten. It was the way the Mustang was looking at him. The animal's dark eyes locked onto his, filled with something James had never seen before. Not just fear, not just pain. It was something deeper, a plea. James took a cautious step forward. The horse didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring at him with those haunted eyes. His heart pounded against his ribs. This wasn't normal. A Mustang would never willingly approach a human, let alone stand at their doorstep in the middle of a blizzard. Something was wrong. James hesitated, but the horse let out another sound, a low, desperate whimper, almost like a cry. And then, to his shock, the Mustang took a shaky step closer, toward the open door. James barely had time to react before the animal's legs buckled. With a heavy thud, the Mustang collapsed onto the porch, his massive body trembling violently. James dropped to his knees. His hands hovered over the horse's thick coat, unsure what to do. "Hey, easy now," he murmured. He didn't even know if the animal could hear him over the wind. The Mustang's breathing was labored, each exhale coming out in a harsh gasp. Ice clung to his muzzle, his nostrils flaring with the effort to breathe. James swallowed hard. He couldn't just leave him out here. The horse wouldn't survive the night in this cold. Making a quick decision, he scrambled to his feet and rushed inside, shoving furniture aside to clear a space. He wasn't even thinking, just moving, acting on instinct. Then, with a deep breath, he hurried back outside, gripping the horse's halter. Wait, a halter? James's pulse jumped. Wild Mustangs didn't wear halters. This horse had belonged to someone. But why was he out here, alone, in this storm? Shoving the questions aside, James braced himself and pulled. The Mustang groaned but didn't fight. Slowly, inch by inch, he helped the massive animal across the threshold, into the warmth of the cabin. As soon as they were inside, James shut the door against the raging storm. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the cabin was eerily quiet. The Mustang lay there, his flanks rising and falling with ragged breaths. James grabbed blankets, tossing them over the shivering animal, then hurried to the fire, stoking the weak flames into a steady blaze. He crouched beside the Mustang, running a hand gently over the damp, freezing coat. "You're safe now," he murmured. But even as he said it, a gnawing unease settled in his gut. Because the horse wasn't just cold. He wasn't just lost. Something had terrified him. Something had driven him to James's door. To beg for shelter, in a way no wild animal ever should, and, as James's hand brushed against the tangled mane, his fingers found something buried in the thick fur, something that shouldn't have been there. His breath caught. He pulled back his hand, and when he looked down, his stomach twisted into a knot. Blood, fresh, warm blood, and then the Mustang's eyes flooded open, locking onto his with an urgency that sent a chill through James's bones. This wasn't over. Something or someone was still out there. James's pulse quickened as the car door creaked open. The woman beside him tensed, gripping the porch railing. The Mustang shifted on his feet, ears pinned back in fear. James instinctively stepped in front of the horse, shielding him from view. The figure from the car didn't move at first. The wind carried the faint crunch of footsteps as someone emerged, dressed in a heavy black coat, face obscured beneath a low-brimmed hat. The person stood motionless, watching. "Who are they?" James asked, without turning his head. The woman's voice was tight. "I don't know, but they've been here before." James's stomach dropped. The memory of the boot print on his porch flashed in his mind. "You said they wanted the horses." She nodded. "They've been targeting Mustangs with unique markings, like Comet." He has a rare white blaze down his forehead. "We thought we scared them off last week when we caught them cutting the fence. But Comet disappeared 2 nights ago." The figure shifted, stepping closer. James raised his rifle just enough to make it clear he wouldn't hesitate to use it. "Stay back," he shouted. The figure halted, then slowly raised a gloved hand in surrender. A voice, low and rough, called out, "We don't want trouble." James tightened his grip. "Then leave." The figure didn't move. The woman's breathing quickened beside him. Comet let out a nervous snort, shifting closer to James. "They won't just leave," she whispered. "They think he's worth thousands." James's mind raced. The nearest sheriff's office was nearly an hour away, and the snow-covered roads wouldn't make it easy for backup to arrive in time. He glanced at the barn. "We need to hide him," he said softly. She hesitated, then nodded. "The back paddock has an old tack room. It locks from the inside." James guided Comet around the side of the house, moving quickly but carefully through the snow. The woman followed. Behind them, the figure remained by the car, but now another shadow stepped out from the passenger side. 2 of them, James's. Heart pounded. He reached the tack room, led Comet inside, and shut the door. The woman secured the lock and whispered, "What now?" James scanned the dim interior. A pitchfork, some rusted tools, an old rope. His eyes landed on a narrow loft. Overhead. "Get up there," he said. She hesitated. "They're not leaving," he said. "They'll come searching." Her face paled, but she obeyed, scrambling up the wooden ladder to the loft. James extinguished the lantern, then crouched beside Comet, stroking the horse's neck to calm him. The Mustang's breath was warm and shaky against his hand. Outside, the snow crunched again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approached the barn. A voice called out, closer this time. "We know he's in there. Hand over the horse." And no one gets hurt. James's grip on the rifle tightened. The Mustang shifted nervously, his hooves scraping the wooden floor. The barn door creaked open. A beam of flashlight light swept across the tack room wall, landing just inches from where James crouched in the shadows. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. The handle rattled. James held his breath. Then the door creaked as the intruder tested the lock. The flashlight beam disappeared. Footsteps retreated a few steps. Then came a new sound. The metallic click of a crowbar being wedged into the door frame. James raised the rifle, heart hammering in his chest. The intruders weren't giving up without a fight. The crowbar groaned against the door frame. The Mustang shifted beneath James's hand, nostrils flaring. His breaths came fast, shallow, each one echoing in the tight space. James's heart raced. He knew if the door gave way, there would be no hiding anymore. The intruder grunted with effort. The wood splintered. James felt the vibration through the floorboards as the lock strained. His finger hovered over the rifle's trigger, but his hands were slick with sweat. He didn't want to shoot, but if they got inside, they would take the horse, and maybe more. "Keep quiet, buddy," James whispered to Comet. The Mustang's ears twitched toward his voice, but his body remained rigid with fear. Another crack splintered through the air as the lock gave out. The door swung open with a crash, banging against the wall. The flashlight beam pierced the darkness, sweeping. Over the hay-strewn floor, two men stood in the doorway. The one in front, tall and broad-shouldered, carried the crowbar. The other clutched a length of rope and scanned the room. "Come on, horsey," the man with the rope muttered. "We've had a long night." James stayed perfectly still, pressing his body against Comet's side. The flashlight passed over them once, then swung back. "There!" the first man barked. He stepped forward. James stood, rifle raised. "Stop!" The man froze, flashlight now blinding James. "You don't want to do this," James said, voice low but firm. The man with the rope shifted nervously. "Let's just go," he said to his partner. But the man with the crowbar shook his head. "That horse is worth a fortune. We're not leaving without him." James steadied the rifle. "If you take one more step, you won't be leaving at all." The man hesitated. The wind howled outside. The barn's wooden walls creaked in the cold. Then the intruder lunged. James didn't have time to think. He squeezed the trigger. The blast shattered the silence. The bullet slammed into the wall just inches from the man's shoulder. He cursed, stumbling backward. The second man turned to run, but tripped over a pile of rope and fell hard on the ground. From the loft above, there was a sudden shift. The woman, unseen until now, dropped down, with a shovel in hand. She swung it with all her strength, cracking it against the first man's arm. The crowbar clattered to the ground. James surged forward. He kicked the crowbar out of reach and pinned the man's arm with his knee. The woman scrambled to restrain the second man, who groaned on the floor. "Call the sheriff," James said. Through clenched teeth, she nodded and sprinted toward the house. The Mustang stood in the shadows, watching, sides heaving. The men cursed beneath their breath, but neither dared move. James kept the rifle steady. His thoughts raced. These men had gone through extraordinary effort to capture a wild horse. But why? Why him? James asked, nodding toward Comet. The man beneath his knee sneered. "That horse is special." "Special how?" The man's eyes flicked toward the Mustang. "Some wild ones go for a lot on the black market. Collectors love rare markings. You've got no idea how much people pay." James's stomach turned. "People pay for this." "Yeah. The ones with the money always want something untamed, something no one else has." The sound of distant sirens carried through the cold air. Blue and red lights soon flickered against the barn walls. James exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The sheriff's deputies stormed in, cuffing the men and hauling them away. The woman leaned against the barn door, face pale but relieved. "It's over," she whispered. James looked at Comet. The Mustang stood calm now, eyes soft but watchful. The sheriff approached. "We've been tracking these guys for months," he said. "Horse trafficking ring. You did the right thing calling us." James's hands trembled as he rubbed Comet's neck. The Mustang leaned into the touch. "He came to me," James said softly, "all the way through the storm." The sheriff gave a low whistle. "Smart animal. He knew where safety was." The deputies left, taking the intruders with them. Dawn crept over the mountains, casting a golden glow on the snow. James turned to the woman. He saved himself. "And maybe us too." She smiled through the exhaustion. "Yeah, and you saved him right back." James knelt beside the Mustang, meeting his steady gaze. "You knew something was wrong," he said, "and you trusted me." Comet nickered softly, leaning into his shoulder. James stood and gave the woman a nod. "Let's get this guy home." Together, they led Comet toward the rising sun, the tracks of the intruders already disappearing beneath the fresh snow. The storm had passed, but the bond forged in that cold, terrifying night would remain, a quiet understanding between a man and a horse who had, against all odds, found their way to each other.